Michigan's Children proudly presents Speaking for Kids, the podcast where we explore crucial conversations impacting the lives of all Michigan children, youth, and families, especially the most vulnerable. Join us each month as we explore public policies and issues in the best interest of our kids and families. We'll bring you lawmakers and policymakers, advocates fighting for change, and the people most affected by those decisions. With our host, Matt Gillard, President and CEO of Michigan's Children, we'll invite you to become engaged too and show you how to take action on what matters most to you. Episodes are recorded live and shared virtually on YouTube and the audio hosting sites Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Hello, and welcome back to Speaking for Kids, the podcast from Michigan's Children, where we discuss public policy, advocacy, and issues impacting children, youth, and families here in Michigan. We're recording today's episode on March 24th, 2023. I'm Matt Gillard, your host and the president and CEO of Michigan's Children. Today's program is specifically about the legislative response to gun violence and school shootings, new reforms before Lansing lawmakers and their potential outcomes, and of course, the people making these changes happen. Last week, the Michigan State Senate approved an 11-bill package to reform gun laws in Michigan, specifically focusing on universal background checks, safe storage laws, and red flag laws to keep weapons out of the hands of dangerous and harmful people. This swift legislative action amidst a rising of very public protests against gun violence, which followed the terrible tragedy that took place at Michigan State University back in February when a gunman fired on 8 students, killing 3 and critically wounding 5 others. Since that time, we've witnessed youth leaders coming together, using their voices to stand up and mobilize young people across campus, really across our state and across the country. They have been among the most influential and powerful speakers before the public and before these legislative committees. Dylan Gebhard is one of those students leading one of these organizations in these efforts here on campus at MSU and in Michigan. And he's one of our guests today, alongside Senator Rosemary Bayer, who is one of the reform package's major sponsors. Senator Bayer also happens to represent the community of Oxford, where another mass shooting took place at a high school in November of 2021, where 4 students died, 7 others were injured, including a teacher. Dylan is part of an organization called Sit Down MSU, which is a leading voice calling for change. So Dylan, why don't you introduce yourself as well? And then Senator, will go to you as well to give a brief introduction of yourself.
Great, Matt. Thank you for having me first and foremost. And Senator, thank you for taking the time to join me on this podcast this morning. But yeah, my name is Dylan Gebhard. I am a senior at Michigan State studying political science. And I also work at the Michigan House as a legislative aide for the majority floor leader. So really got involved with gun violence and Sit Down MSU specifically. Unfortunately, kind of when it hit close to home, I regretfully, it took something that close to me to really take this issue to heart and understand that everyone is kind of affected by this, regardless of age or gender, or race, what have you, kind of affects everybody. So that kind of sparked my passion to tunnel in on this issue and try to use my voice both as a student and now as a legislative aide in the House to try to spark some change here and move these bill packages forward.
Great. And how have you seen this motivate other students? I appreciate obviously your involvement, your engagement, and the personal interest you bring to this. But what's been remarkable, I think, for a lot of us that are involved in the policy advocacy world is that we've really started to see, I think, a groundswell of engagement from your colleagues, your generation, and the kids that you're growing up with here and living through this with. Mm-hmm. How have you seen that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of my more politically predisposed friends have always kind of been the first ones to run and yell from the rooftops. But I think what's unique about this situation is that my friends who have been politically disengaged from virtually every issue and just kind of sit on the sidelines or never thought that political issues had any impact on their lives, now those are my probably most engaged friends. Those are the ones who are really getting out of bed every day with a passion, who are saying, where can my voice make sure that this doesn't happen again to someone else? And that, I think, has been unique, really encouraging from my perspective. and something that I really hope continues. But I think it's a new blend of people who are in the mix. It's not just my political science friends and people who study this specifically. And now it's my human bio majors and my environmental science kids. It's pretty much it's a very diverse set of kids who I think are personally engaged and fired up to make something happen.
And that's great to hear. That's not only how change happens, that is change happening, right? I mean, that's the engagement that's going to be required for us to make the changes we want to see happen. All right, Senator, why don't you give us a brief introduction of yourself and then kind of tell us what's in this package that's passed so far?
Sure. Yeah, I am the state senator for District 13, which is kind of Southwest Oakland County in Western Wayne. This is my second term in office. I have been the chair for the Firearm Safety and Violence Prevention Caucus, which is bicameral, both houses, for the last few years, and built it up to about 53 people, actually. A lot of people engaged in this issue, happily engaged before we got to some of the worst of the happenings in the last 2 years. I did not go to Lansing to work on gun violence prevention. I did, however, go with suicide as one of my issues that I wanted to help with because of personal things. And in my early work there, trying to learn what's possible, what can we do, one of the things I learned was that most suicide is actually with the firearm. It's almost 2/3. And most gun deaths are suicides. So when you look at that formula, it tells you really need to work on that problem. And that is actually how I got involved with the red flag laws, because those are directly targeting suicide more than anything else. They also do they do potentially, but have had impact in this situation where people who are probably need different kinds of help do some kind of mass shooting, that's the red flag laws can have a real impact there. The numbers of people engaged are luckily not nearly as big as the suicide realm, but the visibility of those things, like what happened at Michigan State and at Oxford, people see those more than they see suicide, as sad as that is. I mean, it's all horrific for the people who live through it. So that's how I got involved. The packages themselves, there are 3. And as much as we really moved to get those done as quickly as possible because of the Michigan State shooting, the second of our mass shootings in our state in a year, basically. And we had been working on them. We'd introduced an earlier version of them multiple times, pretty much every session for the last 8 or 10 years. But knowing that once we knew we were going to have the majority this year, we started working on actually updating those 3 packages: the safe storage, the universal background checks, and the red flag laws. We knew we had a chance to actually make those be turned into law now. So we started working on them in November of last year, working with a lot of outside groups, national gun violence prevention groups that care around the state, law enforcement groups and religious groups. And I mean, we had an amazing number of organizations, student groups that had input into what these new bills should look like. So over the last 2 weeks, we did pass 11 bills representing all 3 of those issues over to the House, and got so far 6 of them back. We did not get the red flag bills back yet. They're still over there, still working on things. We're working now as a joint team with them so that we can get those done, hopefully shortly after we come back from the spring break here. But the good news is the first sets, the universal background checks and the safe storage, are winging their way over to the governor's desk today.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And, obviously this is an issue we're focused on in Michigan. In transparency, I'm actually in Washington, D.C. today as we record this, and this is a hot issue here as it is everywhere in the country. What's exciting is that we're starting to see legislation actually move in Michigan to start to address some of these things. Unfortunately, at least some of it is because of the result of what we've seen with these terrible incidents occurring in Michigan. as well. But the politics around this are interesting as well, right? So I actually heard Governor Whitmer this morning on one of the national news shows talking about her surprise that some of the votes are actually coming out bipartisan. And there is actually some Republican support for a few of these measures. At the same time, we're discouraging committee hearings led by Republicans in the House here in DC as recently as yesterday. Just about what you see as the impact specifically of groups like Dylan's and the young people really engaging on this issue specifically.
Having people engaged is the number one factor for us, to be honest. People, because we see the opposition, right? That people are speaking out against this stuff. But over and over again, we've had polls in Michigan that just it's incredible support across the state. 90% for universal background checks and 85% for safe storage. And that includes Republicans, and that includes gun owners and Republican gun owners. I mean, 85 to 90%, and even in the red flags, which is more complex and people don't really understand the suicide issue. But even that one is over 75% support. So when you look at that, anyone who represents people, if you work in a representative role, I don't know how you could vote no on it, because your people want it. There's an odd thing. The political piece of it is harder for somebody like me to understand, as much as I have to admit I have a political job. I never actually learned politics and I don't really like it. So it's like, how could you possibly not do what your people are telling you to do? I don't get that piece. I don't get it at all. But having the support, we had students outside on the Capitol steps every day after that shooting, and you can't miss them when they're on the Capitol steps. You see them when you go to work. So that's a really strong thing, and it's hard for anybody, even someone who is opposed, to look at kids sitting out there on the ground trying to make us see why this is important. How could you not see that? And I know they see it. I also know they're under a different kind of pressure to vote a certain way on things that are purely politics, even though some of them who have told us in the past they're in support, they voted no this time because they were kind of forced into it. And that's a sad thing. I fundamentally disagree with that. I wouldn't work for a team that told me I had to vote a way I didn't agree with.
Well, and I think, from my perspective, and I've obviously been around this game, this politics game for a long time as well. And I think, unfortunately, it's easy for people my age to just, kind of throw in the towel and say, well, the Republicans just aren't going to support that, or it's just not going to happen. But what's exciting to me about these efforts now, or what seems to be happening, is the young people, that's just not an option for them. They don't, they don't see it in that regard. And it's not, they're going to change who those folks are if those folks aren't going to listen to them and do what is obviously right and is, supported by the masses, as you say. So Dylan, talk about that aspect of it for a little bit. That's what's really, I think, from my perspective, changing the game and changing the dynamic politically around this issue, is the young people coming into this without any baggage, or just, without any care about what the historical political, lanes are on this stuff.
Absolutely. I think it's incredibly inspiring firsthand that there's no partisanship or any sort of that political game. With my generation, it's very much a life or death situation. Especially when you look at many different issues, from climate change to gun violence, this is not something that we look at our parents and say, oh, my parents think this way about gun violence and gun reform, therefore I'm going to think the same way. It's no, I have been doing school shooting drills myself personally since I can remember, and I have a different perspective than my parents have. So I think at a fundamental level, we have a lot of children, a lot of kids who might traditionally be predisposed towards partisanship and just kind of grandfathering in their parents' beliefs towards something. They have a fundamentally different personal experience towards these issues that's lending them towards a more proactive, unique perspective that kind of is removed from the traditional partisanship that you might see surrounding different issues. But also very encouraging as someone who's politically engaged and has friends who are now engaged in the issue. It's very inspiring and encouraging that they're not kind of adopting different viewpoints. They're kind of falling back on their own personal experience. And I think that's the difference.
No, I think you're absolutely right. My daughter's a sophomore at Penn State right now in college. And yeah, she grew up obviously in a political, household and political world. But I mean, it's just she has zero patience for it. She's like, what do you mean? They say no. They're it's not. So I mean that's the part. It's unfortunate, obviously, that it had the, or that we're talking about it and it manifested at least in some way around these terrible tragedies. But the reality is this has changed. This has changed in our country, change for the better. But this is how change happens, and change is happening because of the efforts that you're undertaking and thousands others like you, around Michigan and around the country right now. And so, let's talk about that. One, what are next steps? So, I think, clearly the package of bills that's moving right now through the legislature is important, is something that we certainly at Michigan's Children support, and we think is obviously a step in the right direction. But this isn't the end, is it?
Not at all. Not at all. This is getting the kind of the groundwork laid to do a lot more things. I don't know if I'm a data geek, so I'm only going to do a little bit of this, but we have almost half the guns of the world in our country. And the number of gun violence incidents in this country is off the charts. Multiple times as many incidents here as the next country down on the list. There's a direct statistical correlation between the number of guns and the amount of violence. Ultimately, we need to change the formula here. We need to do some things about what's happening with this situation. We actually are being sued by other countries because we're such high traffickers in illegal firearms. It's got to end. I mean, there has to be an end to this. We have to move in a different direction. So for us in Michigan, we are working on other legislation, things that will hold manufacturers accountable, hold sellers accountable, require insurance. I mean, all kinds of things that will directly address the ownership of firearms. While we do other things, there's some interesting new legislation that's specifically designed to work to help people who are suicidal, have suicidal ideation. And obviously, we're spending a lot of time and a lot of money on mental health in Michigan, because that is the underlying cause for the suicide attempts, and successful or otherwise. So we have to because partly because it's the number one firearm cause. Those two things are so intertwined. You must talk about both of them when you talk about suicide. So that's, like I said, that was how I got involved in the first place. And I think we're going to continue to find both legislative and departmental ways to address that specific side of the problem as well.
Great. Dylan, what about from your end? What's next for the advocacy efforts? I mean, how do you see this movement continuing from the college students?
Yeah, I know a lot of people like myself aren't really going to rest because we have some of the most basic fundamental laws maybe on the books now moving forward. I think as great as this initial kind of first steps are, I don't think they are the end all be all for pretty much anybody who has been impacted or cares about this issue as much as a lot of us do. So I really see this movement kind of continuing until the gun violence is something that our kids can't relate to. I don't think I'm going to be personally happy until gun violence is kind of spoke about as like lawn darts or something that happened back in the day, and we can kind of reminisce about and talk about as a thing of the past. I mean, really, I think the bills are a great step forward. It's remarkable that we're in a space now in Michigan that we can actually move bills like this and have hearings and pass them, and that is also remarkable. But I think it's only the beginning, and so we can actually work to have a country we recognize and we can pass on to our children without fear of more.
Well, and I think that's actually what's next, right? I mean, is this the only good thing about what's happening is that we have young people finally. There's something important enough that you guys are really jumping in. We need you to do that. And as much as we can sit here and feel bad that we're giving you this legacy to deal with, right? We did it with the environment too. And, there are those of us who are working on it now, but we're going to need you. There's no question about that. We're going to need you to help lead, to drive this. Actually, we would rather work for you. You're smarter, you're younger, you got more energy, all those things. I want to be on your team, and you need to make your team bigger. It's just that fundamental. And politics, as much as I don't like it, I'm not good at it. I don't think it's going to go away soon. And so we're going to need your generation to help with that too. We need to clean it up, right? It's pretty sloppy at best, but nasty in its worst circumstances. Kind of get the money out of there, kind of get the, there's some things that can be changed that can make the running of the company and things like they're happening now not happen, because we have a more reasonable way of running things. Money is, they say the root of all evil, and I actually think that might be true. At least when it comes to politics.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the young people are changing. I mean, the reality is the reason we're in the position today that we are to have these conversations, and frankly, that these bills are passing, is because the young people did vote in the last election and elected Democrats, frankly, in the legislature, and reelected the governor. And so I don't, and that was before, frankly, the tragedy that we saw at MSU. And I don't see that changing. I am a firm believer that Dylan and his colleagues and that generation are going to change things and change them for the better, and the sooner the better from my perspective, right? So we're excited about this. Like I said, it's unfortunate that one of the issues that's driving this, at least right now, is this terrible epidemic of gun violence that's existing, has existed and continues to exist in our country. But change is happening, and folks better recognize it and get on board, right? Or get out of the way, because it's coming. So let's just, before we close here, Dylan, what's for our listeners, at least, what's kind of the mood on campus? I mean, despite the loss last night from the basketball team, but maybe in a broader sense, what's the mood on campus? We live in Okemos. We're on campus often. Does it seem, obviously things are different, but does it seem to be improving?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag for a lot of folks. On one hand, I have a lot of friends who are grateful to be back in the swing of things, and all they kind of want to do is get back in the classroom and focus back on their studies, and that's their way of kind of moving forward. And then I also have friends who haven't been able to get back on campus yet. They can't really bring themselves to do it. And personally, I've only been on campus probably 3 or 4 times since the incident. I think Berkey Hall was the first class, or the first hall I ever had a class in. So that building will never be the same. And I think moving forward, it's always going to be different. It's always going to be difficult. But I do think things are improving. A lot of my friends have gotten back into some sort of normal. I don't want to sit here and say that being on campus is the right thing or the wrong thing for anybody to do. But whatever normal is, I think people are moving closer to it. I will say that campus feels a lot more collective now. It feels like we all have, unfortunately, another through line with each other. Another thing that's bringing us closer together. COVID kind of disrupted a lot of my class's flow of things. So to have something that just kind of brought us all together again, if there is ever a silver lining in a tragedy like this, I think that would be it. But I'd say it's difficult. There's a mixed bag. Some of your students might be happy to be back on campus, and others might not get back to it this year or ever again. And I think either way, that's okay. But that's the mood that I've firsthand experienced.
Yeah, and that's the reality, right? Unfortunately. All right, Senator. So for folks who are listening to this, we've talked a lot about how the young people are changing this, and that's exciting and that's great. But how can anybody get engaged in this issue, or how can anybody do their part to make sure that this issue stays top of mind for elected officials and, as a priority, as it clearly is right now? But how can we continue to make sure that this focus on gun reform and school safety stays top of mind for elected officials and policymakers?
It's really actually pretty easy. You need to call them. It's really that. There's not a single one of us who doesn't open the mail, doesn't listen to phone calls, those are our bosses. That's fundamental. So call your representative, call your senator, tell them what you want. And what I suggest is tell them, if you don't vote for these, I'm not voting for you. If you don't help with this, I'm not voting for you. It's really direct. And it's not
Absolutely.
complicated, and you can look it up. You can go to Michigan Senate on your search engine, and you'll see the list. You'll see our names, you'll see our phone numbers. If you don't know who your senator is, you can type in Google, "Who is my Michigan State Senator?" and it'll tell you.
You can also see who voted yes and who voted no as well.
You can always see who voted yes and no, yeah.
On the Michigan House site as well. So no, thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more. I firmly believe in Dylan and in his generation to change this, but the change will happen sooner if all of us get engaged and make sure it remains a priority. And so thank you. I want to end there and thank Senator Baer for being here today, and thank Dylan for being here today, and thank both of them for the work that they're doing on this very important issue. If you would like to share a link to today's podcast, please look for one and other resources on our michiganschildren.org website under the Resource and Speaking for Kids podcast site. We'll be back next month for another crucial conversation about issues impacting children and families of Michigan. Thank you for joining us today.
You've been listening to Speaking for Kids, the podcast for Michigan's children with host Matt Gillard. Thanks for joining us. To explore these and other issues relevant to our state's children, youth, and families, and to build your advocacy muscle, go to our website at www.michiganschildren.org. You'll find links and news about past and future podcast topics under our Resource tab and action alerts under the Take Action tab. Find and like us on Facebook and Twitter. Terry Bannis and Stephen Wallace produced this podcast. Contact them with your questions and ideas for other topics. Michigan's Children is a nonprofit advocacy organization, an independent voice working to reduce disparities in child outcomes from cradle to career through policy change.